Yo, this is Mike, Ringmaster of the Imagination Circus, and today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. I've liked the idea of doing reviews. I've done a couple in the past. I liked how they turned out, but frankly, they're a bit too time-consuming individually speaking. So what I've decided to do is take a note from another channel by the name of Cosmodor on their videos, or his videos, concerning SpongeBob. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of SpongeBob, but I still found these videos very entertaining. These videos were essentially a ranking of the episodes from worst to best of the first few seasons of SpongeBob, and he has continued to do so to this very day, though they are slow to come out. And if you're interested, go check those out. Go check out his channel. He's an interesting guy. I might leave a link in the description. Cosmodor. He's pretty cool. Anyway, the way that this is going to work is I'm going to rank the first episodes in the first season of MLP. No, not the first episodes, all of the episodes. Now, one thing that you should note is that I will be counting the first two-parter, premiere, or pilot, whatever, as a single story, and I will be doing that with any two-parters or any episodes that, of course, lead right into the next one in the future. So, not necessarily counting episodes that take place from a different perspective. That's similar, but it's a little bit different because they are still technically two different stories, even if they are happening simultaneously. But I'll get into that in my future videos. Right now, we're doing Season 1 of My Little Pony Friendship is Magic, and we're going to be going, you know, from what I consider my favorites or the worst episodes to the best episodes in the season. And make note, worst is just a way to say that, like, they're the episodes I don't think hold up as strongly as others. Regardless, let's get into it, shall we? This episode, it's not great. I don't like it. I don't, look, Spike is my favorite character, and while I may say it or said it before here or in the past, the fact is that Season 1 is not responsible for him being my favorite. If anything, because this is the one character-focused episode on him in Season 1, and I gotta be honest, it's not great. We get Owlicious, which is an interesting addition in that now Twilight has a pet like so many others of the main six. But ignoring that bit, because it's not really relevant at this point, Spike here is shown as a jealous, petulant child. True, it highlights his greatest fear that we see shown later, that Twilight will abandon him or want him to go away at some point, and that has been shown multiple times throughout the series later on. But outside of that fact, it just doesn't paint Spike in a great view, and it doesn't paint anybody else in the main six in a great view either, especially Twilight, who, outside of saving Spike at the end from a much larger, much more dangerous dragon, doesn't really come off great. And I can't really say much more than that other than this episode is something of a disappointment. It does have a couple of good ideas. In fact, its overall premise is not bad, but it's not greatly executed. Spike and Twilight both don't come out great, and Spike, as my favorite character, it's not a great start for his character when it comes to individual episodes. Okay, so a bit of a story. In having to rewatch both this and Griffin the Brush-Off in the past, I came to the conclusion, I assumed I would find this episode way more entertaining and Griffin the Brush-Off the disappointment, but I found it to be the complete opposite. While Griffin the Brush-Off was well done with great characterization and pretty entertaining overall, I would have to say that Ghostbusters was kind of an annoyance to me from the beginning to end. From the main six heckling the, you know, Trixie barely into her performance before she really shows how much of a jerk she was at this stage in her life, to Twilight's stubborn refusal to show off her talent, which, while understandable, still gets on my nerves just a bit. But the big issue, and I hate to say this because I'm one of those people who's never really had a problem with these two, as I pointed out in the past, but Snips and Snails. Oh, Snips and Snails. You know, I can understand why nobody likes these two. Even though they barely show up, The fact that, like, this episode really is the reason for the absolute vitriol I've seen throughout the fandom for these two. And I can understand why. They do something incredibly stupid by going more than likely into the Everfree Forest, but beyond that, just going to find an Ursa Major. And by complete happenstance, they happen upon an Ursa's cave, and they find an Ursa Minor instead. Not knowingly, of course. And then, of course, there's the fact that these two don't really get punished at the end. Like I said, they go into a cave trying to bring an Ursa Major just so Trixie can fight it. And what happens? It not only almost destroys Ponyville, and honestly, if Twilight wasn't there, I feel like the place might have even been destroyed, and a lot of life might have been lost. The point is that at the end of this whole sequence of events, these two are not punished. Instead, they are rewarded, essentially, with mustaches. And frankly, that's just not okay. Alright, that is my biggest issue with these characters, and not really the characters in themselves, but the episode as a whole. These two doing something this stupid I can overall accept, especially since they don't really show up all that often, at least, and not even in any major role in the future, even if they do end up becoming stock characters. But the fact that the episode ends without them getting any sort of real punishment kind of just gets on my nerves. The fact that the episode only reinforces Spike's stupid crush on Rarity does not help. Overall, I'd say this episode is not great. It doesn't really work. I'd say it's a pretty below average episode at best. This episode is entertaining. It could have been better. Applejack and Rainbow start out in a simple competition together, and it shows how these two more or less interact in the future, in the sense that they're definitely good friends, but they're also ultra competitive when they go against each other. And it's kind of interesting. If these two are ever in an argument or can't get along, it's because of the exact opposite reason that dear old Rarity and Applejack can't get along. While Rarity and Applejack are too different, interestingly enough, Rainbow and Applejack are almost too similar. Both are stubborn, competitive, they hold their own views in high regard, and they have trouble listening to others, though I would say Applejack has a slightly less of a problem, especially after the events of Applebuck season. I will say that the competition overall is super entertaining, but at the end it derails into these two kind of getting the wrong impression of each other and being just bullheaded and not being willing to compromise what they think is going on. And because of that, they both lose the competition, the race, and hell, they even fall behind Twilight, who didn't win, but she still managed to pace herself well enough to do better than these two with them not paying attention. And between the two of them, they could have easily won first and second. Regardless, they could have easily done that good, but they didn't because they got caught up in the competition with each other more than the competition with every pony else. And because of that, they lost, and they lost in the worst way possible by thinking the other was cheating and ended up cheating themselves just to try and get even. Overall, I'd say the episode is good, but this bit here is flawed, but it's something, however, that I will say that the writers decide to keep in their characters in the future, and I will say, good on them on continuing to use this, because honestly, not a lot of people would necessarily do so, because a lot of people would see it as too much of a flaw and something that they wouldn't want to show to children, but they decide to show that an overgrown sense of ego and stubbornness can cause these kind of problems. Not a bad lesson to learn, but it could have been better executed. But overall, I'd say it was pretty entertaining and worth watching at least once. Honestly, what can I say about this episode? To be perfectly honest, there's really not that much wrong with it, but if I had to say something about it, I would say that it's kind of boring. You know, especially considering it's meant to be the first of 3 episodes that contain pretty much the first storyline of the entire series, like the first ongoing storyline. And frankly, I think they could have done better. It's the fact that this follows up the great 2-parter that is Friendship and Magic Part 1 and 2. This whole thing, it doesn't keep my attention. It doesn't keep me enthralled. The thing about this episode, it's just unimaginatively, remarkably mind-numbingly boring. It showcases a phoenix in a very interesting and somewhat funny manner, but it's overall not for me. It's not a terrible episode, it's not a bad episode, it's a somewhat forgettable episode, but overall it's just meh. That is the best way I can put it. This episode is pretty meh. Winter wrap-up. I'm gonna be honest, I've never really seen the appeal of the episode, or at the very least the song. Because even before I got into the fandom, I had heard the song. It's catchy, yes, I will give you that. It's ridiculously catchy, but it just... I don't get it. I just don't get it. Regardless of that, though, the episode itself isn't bad. In fact, I'd say it's about a middle-of-the-road episode. It's good, but at the same time, it's not the kind of thing I would want to come back to watch again if I absolutely had to. This episode shares some problems with some other episodes. Specifically that it's sort of boring and sort of annoying. The boring comes from the situation. I mean, don't get me wrong. You can totally make this setup work under the right circumstances. Having a, interesting slumber party is not impossible. In fact, I think I've read a couple of fan fictions where it works out just fine and is fairly entertaining. But the way it's done here just does not do it for me. I mean, really, it's specifically because of the conflict between the main characters. And I've heard it said before when it comes to superheroes fighting each other head-to-head, but I don't like it anymore with minor conflicts and arguments like in this episode. I do not want to see the main characters or heroes of a story fighting each other unless it makes sense in the narrative. And here, it's just really annoying. Yes, it kind of makes sense for the narrative, but it just gets on my nerves. And outside of that, everything else going on here is boring. Don't get me wrong, like their arguing is annoying, but it's almost entertaining compared to everything else that's going on in the episode. I kind of find it amusing the way Twilight is trying to do a slumber party, like she's never done it before and she's doing it by a book. Literally by a book. And while that's fine, and very much in Twilight's character, her obliviousness also being in character, it just adds to the annoying after a while. I will say that the resolution and lesson is pretty good, finding a mixture and being able to work together between practicality and frivolousness to create a perfect mix. I'd rather not call Rarity frivolous, especially since she ranks higher as one of my favorite characters compared to Applejack, but the fact is that I don't really know what else to call her. I guess being an artist myself, I guess I could call it. Regardless, this episode could have been better. It could have been really good if it had just been written a little bit more interestingly. But the resolution was good. I can live with it. It's not a terrible episode. It's just not a very interesting one. Artistic intuition. So if you can find a good mix between practicality and artistic intuition, then alright, I'll give it to you. And that's exactly what these two managed to do at the end. Clearing out the tree branch that went through poor old Twilight's window. So, this episode is pretty cringe, at least at the end. But here's the thing, it's cringe on purpose. It's meant to show that the CMC don't really have a grasp on who they quite are yet. That they do have talents and that those talents are there. And while I've never been a fan of this sense of humor, apparently those of Ponyville are. And, well, the Cutie Mark Crusaders weren't disappointed. They were happy to win the award even if they didn't get their cutie marks. And they didn't. Even though displaying certain talents or certain abilities throughout the episode, and if they're future cutie marks or anything to go by, then it's clear that those talents have something to do with who they are and who they're, meant to be and what their destiny is and blah, blah, blah. It's definitely entertaining in parts, and it's fun to actually see the CMC working together and to get a better grasp on all of these characters, especially together, as that's how we'll see them most of the time as the series goes on. But overall, I'd say this episode is pretty average. Green isn't your color. A combination episode with Rarity and Fluttershy. Not a bad combination if I do say so myself. I think it makes sense. Of all of the characters in the main 6, I feel like Fluttershy hanging out with Rarity is one of the few that makes a lot of sense. If I were to scale it, I would say that Rarity would probably be at the top, right above Rainbow Dash, with Rainbow Dash only being as high as she is because her and Flutters have been friends since childhood, and as such there is that connection, even if Rainbow at this point can be a bit harsh to Flutters. And you know what? I think this is a decent episode for the two of them to be in together. It shows that Fluttershy is willing to help out her friends even if she's wholly uncomfortable and really doesn't want to be in the situation. And it shows Rarity that despite her generosity can be jealous and has this desire to be in the limelight, and but at the same time is more than willing to make a sacrifice even if she herself wants to do it. The irony being that neither of them are happy because they're trying to do something for the other. It shows that they're both generous and kind people, or ponies in this case, and that because of that, they are more than willing to do something and make a sacrifice for others, in this case, individuals they care about. What they fail to realize is that neither is happy, and therefore they should quit because of that. We also get a nice side view on Twilight, being that most of these episodes, if not all of them, involve her learning a lesson, because she's still learning about friendship at this point, or at least learning about friendship consistently, so to speak, means that, of course, there's always going to be some focus on her, regardless of who the actual focus of the episode is on. In this case, Twilight is preview to both of their problems and wants to help, but, of course, Pinkie, being the friend that she is telling her to keep their feelings to herself because they told her not to tell any pony. And while I agree that Pinkie is kind of right in that if someone tells you a secret, you should probably keep it unless it hurts them in particular. That is the big mistake Pinkie makes here. And I think, honestly, under the circumstance, again, normally you should definitely keep the person's secret. But if it's hurting them or some pony else, in this case, you definitely need to tell. And in this case, they didn't really need to, but at the same time, the way the episode is resolved could have been handled better. It's definitely entertaining, and I'd say it's entertaining overall. The message is good, and it showcases that both of these characters, even with their flaws, Rarity's being that she just, you know, can get jealous, and in this case, their insecurities. In this case, the fact that, you know, Fluttershy just, despite apparently making a fantastic model, just does not want to be out in public and being showcased the way she was in this episode. It makes sense, and I think it works for what it is. It's not a great episode, but it's an entertaining one with a few minor flaws. And it would definitely, I say, be worth coming back to once in a while. Alright, best night ever. At this point, it is one of only 2 single-part finale episodes for the entire series. And it's not a terrible way to go. At this point, they hadn't decided to make every finale some epic fight for the survival of Equestria itself. And that's fair. At this point, they didn't know. But it makes sense in the future that they would focus on the adventure for the finales and premiere episodes more than anything else. Here, however, we have the long and first-running storyline of the series. The finale is the finale to both the season and the storyline being that the eventual going of the Grand Galloping Gala. And it's an interesting thing. Honestly, the episode isn't one of my favorites, but it is entertaining. And it does showcase the entirety of the main 6. It also showcases Spike's disappointment in that he can't hang out with the rest of his friends, even though he really wanted to. And the fact that the rest of the main 6 were so focused on their individual goals showcases that in the end, they really didn't want to go to the gala to be at the gala, with the exception of Pinkie. They all had their own reasons to go. Hell, Twilight was almost there obligatorily, even if it was her first time going. Whereas every pony else had their own reasons, and honestly, their own reasons don't make sense. As I will point out in this video I recommend for you all to watch, by 1cc or Canned Cream for short, I think I got that wrong. actually reverse that, but the point is, this episode, from a person who has not made a video in quite a while, which saddens me, but when he was making quite a bit of content, he made this video, and I think it's a pretty good video, and it highlights why every one of the main six, with the exception of Pinky, really shouldn't have gotten that extra ticket back in what I consider one of the most boring episodes of the series, that being Ticketmaster. So regardless, please go watch this because it'll highlight several things that I think are very significant to the episode, but regardless, the overall episode itself was pretty entertaining. And plus, we got this.
You're going to love me!
Yeah, I don't know how else to describe that. So, overall, this episode is entertaining. It's definitely not the worst season finale out of all of them. And then again, I don't know. Maybe I'll do a video where I rank the season finales in the future. But don't take that as a guarantee of it happening. I'm just saying I might do that. My point is, this is not the worst episode the series has ever put out. It's a decent finale, it's entertaining, and it's got some very, very good bits in it. And yeah. This episode is here in this placement on this list for one reason alone. It is the most forgettable episode in the entirety of Season 1 of My Little Pony Friendship is Magic. And let me explain what I mean. While I was going over the list of episodes, writing them down as I remembered them, and as I counted up the episodes in question, I realized, I forgot one. I had 25 episodes, counting at the time the two-parter as 2 episodes instead of the 1 that it really is. But I counted 25 instead of 26, and I realized, one episode is missing. So I went through, and I realized while going to the wiki for MLP that, okay, I forgot a dog and pony show. And I'm gonna be honest, this isn't even a bad episode. It's just wholly forgettable, or at least it was forgettable to me. Of all the episodes in the series in the first season, when I thought about it, it was like, is this episode even from Season 1? And it's like, okay, it is. I don't know, it feels very much like a Season 2 episode, which may or may not come off as a compliment, but the fact is, it's really not that bad an episode. It's actually got a decent premise, and it's got the main characters going off to rescue another one of the main characters. It's Rarity focused, being that she is the one who's been kidnapped by the Diamond Dogs, and it's got a pretty interesting David Bowie reference. Let's not forget that. But Rarity's situation is where it's at. And while I do find her act to be a little bit annoying, that's kind of on purpose. So I'll give her credit for that. And it is a Rarity-focused episode. And while future episodes on this list might do better when it comes to focusing on this character, who I happen to like quite a bit, I have to say, this episode, it's not bad. Not only does the rest of the main 6 focus on rescuing Rarity and Spike doing this of all things.
I'm coming for you, my lady! Hi-ho, Twilight! Away! And just what do you think you're doing?
Please, Twilight, just give me this.
Fine.
Like, tell me that isn't funny. And hell, you could say we even get a bit of focus on Spike, which, again, we just do not get really at all, at least not very well, in this first season. So I think that works out pretty well. And not only that, but Rarity didn't even technically need rescuing. She got out of the situation on her own, showing that while she was a damsel, she was not in distress. And yeah, the damsel in distress trope can be done well, but in this case, they subverted it completely, and they allowed Rarity to get out of the situation. While her friends were still trying to rescue her, she got out of it on her own, and that was really good, and I applaud them for that. But I place it here only for this, because for the love of all that is holy, I forgot it existed for a moment. And as good as this episode is, you can't really get past that. So I'm afraid it has to go here. This episode is good for Applejack in many ways. One, it's probably one of the best episodes to focus on her character that we've gotten the whole series, not just in this season. Two, it's a pretty good lesson that I happen to relate to quite a bit. What with being stubborn and not letting other people to help you, or ponies as the case were. It's entertaining, it's got a lot of funny gags, some don't always land, no pun intended, but frankly, they do, in fact, do the trick more often than not. I find this episode pretty entertaining, and I'm happy to have seen it, and while I don't come back to it that often, it's one I'd be more than willing to rewatch if I had to. I like this episode, but at the same time, I don't know if I would go so far as to call it good. It's definitely not bad, but I don't know if I would really call it good. The big issue here is the way this episode is written. The voice acting and animation are great, the pacing is pretty good, but something about the way it's written, specifically pertaining to the characters in a lot of cases, is what drives me crazy. Now, something I do kind of like about this episode is that it's sort of a focus on Pinkie Pie, and the first real episode to do so. Even though, ironically, she's kind of a background character in the episode, she almost gets more focus because of it, making her stand out more among the main six, and showing her quirks. While at the same time, the situation escalates because she doesn't really explain herself all that well, and that's one of the big problems here. Outside of Pinkie not being able or apparently willing to fully explain herself, at least in a way that her friends will understand, especially since she's hardly stupid, and the fact that they don't seem to want to listen, or are unwilling to listen to her in this case. Which is weird as far as I'm concerned, considering that we later see Applejack listen to Pinkie when it comes to something like her Pinkie sense. So the fact that she's unwilling to listen here, granted, Applejack herself doesn't show up until a little bit later, the fact is that she still doesn't listen, and in fact seems to call out Pinkie in the worst possible way. So overall, I'd say this is another mixed bag episode. It's definitely leaning towards the good side, but at the same time, I feel like the flaws in the character writing just kind of bring it down. So I'd say it's overall entertaining, but it could use some work. There are other Fluttershy-focused episodes that I enjoy just a little bit more, but overall I'd say this one did a pretty good job, and it introduced an ability I find quite remarkable, and frankly quite underutilized, all things considered. This episode is good. It's another great character episode, which seems to be what this season seems to be excelling at overall, and frankly I enjoy it quite a bit. This episode is interesting for a couple of reasons. I think that there are those who handled it better than I, and therefore I shall point you all to a review by one Josh Scorcher, who he did a couple of years ago, a collab of sorts, on this very episode, because I think he'll handle it a lot better than I ever could. So if you really want to get my thoughts on it, I pretty much agree with him 100%, so watch it if you feel so inclined. But I will say, I find this episode pretty funny, and I like it overall. Does it have some things I disagree with, or think could have been done better? Sure. But like I said, you'll get a better idea of that if you watch the episode review by one Josh Scorcher. It's a good episode, it's a funny episode, it adds another interesting hoofed animal to the list of sapient species in this world, and it's entertaining, and the message isn't terrible. More than just an episode focusing on Apple Bloom's personality or her wanting to get her cutie mark, this episode is meant to introduce us to the Cutie Mark Crusaders, whose story is one of the longest running in the entirety of the series. And I have to say, while I did get into the fandom pretty late, well past the point where their story had ended, I caught up, I watched all of the episodes, and I have to tell you, at the end, I cried. I cried quite a bit, and this is the beginning of that story, and I have to say, it's a pretty good beginning. we get introduced to one of the characters among these three, and we get to know her pretty well. We get to know her struggle, and as we meet the last two at the end fully, we get the sense that, yeah, their struggle is about the same, and that the reason these three bond so well is because they feel it. It's that connection of being outsiders and not having their cutie marks. It's having something in common that they can truly work towards together is what gets them to work together. It's the kind of friendship that works in real life that you just don't see all that much in fiction. And it works out so well here, and we get to know them so well in the future with everything that they do, that I'm happy to say this is a really good episode for what it is. And despite a few hiccups early on, I think it ends pretty damn well, and it's the great beginning to a great storyline that I was really sad and at the same time really proud to see come to an end. This episode is interesting for me, specifically in that having rewatched it fairly recently, and again for this little video you're watching now, I have to say I found it way more entertaining than I expected. I felt like I got a better grasp of Gilda's character than you would really expect for someone like her, especially considering that I doubt they had her redemption planned out as early as this, but for some reason I feel like the way she's characterized here perfectly fits with what we see later. And they did such a great job, and that's despite the fact that you wouldn't think you would be able to redeem a character like this, when it's, especially in a show like this, so early on. But they do it eventually, and I think the way that Gilda is characterized here really works for that. Outside of that, we have someone like Rainbow Dash. Rainbow Dash is also pretty well characterized, as is Pinkie. In fact, pretty much everybody is well characterized here, especially for those three characters just mentioned who are in the spotlight, and they all work out. And even the little bits we see from everybody else, even this tiny bit from Old Rarity showing her, like, kind of, you know, exasperation, but otherwise not being bothered by the prank that Pinkie and Rainbow pulled on her. You know, she doesn't really care all that much, and that kind of works perfectly within her character throughout the series, as we'll see later on. Then there's Twilight, who, while, you know, not showing great support to Pinkie at this moment, that kind of fits within her character as well. She's not going to immediately jump to support her friend's claims at this point, because at this point she hasn't learned that you sometimes have to believe your friends regardless. Now, I already talked about Gilda, but as I said, Pinkie and Rainbow really come off great here. We get the sense of Rainbow's exasperation in that she can't pull a prank on someone like, say, Fluttershy, and how Fluttershy's weakness, you could say, for lack of a better term, annoys her at this point. Then there's Pinkie, who is so understanding because she pretty much knows everybody in town that she can understand that you can't prank Fluttershy. And Rainbow, who's known Fluttershy forever, who should know this, only really has to be reminded of it because of her rather headstrong personality where she doesn't always think through her moves. But despite something like that maybe coming off as showing like Rainbow as being a bit brutish, we later see that she's more than loyal to her friends, and seeing that Gilda was more than enough of a jerk, she decided to stay loyal to Pinkie and everybody else in Ponyville after the ridiculous outburst that Gilda unfortunately let out. And while Gilda was definitely a jerk, I can kind of understand her. As I said, her characterization here is amazingly strong in that I can kind of understand why she would get so annoyed. More than anything, she doesn't really want to hang out with anybody but Rainbow, so that doesn't help. And because she's not speaking up for herself, she kind of gets dragged into this party regardless, and all of the continuous pranks that she immediately assumes is Pinkie's work kind of gets to her in the end. The fact that it just happened to be Rainbow, you know, is kind of interesting. I will say it's a bit convoluted that all the pranks hit Gilda in particular, but regardless, this episode turned out to be way more entertaining than I thought on rewatch, and I'm more than happy to recommend it to anyone old and new to the fandom. This episode is pretty funny, as you would want from an episode focused almost exclusively on Pinkie.
Spike, honestly, you're overreacting.
This This episode is good for a couple of reasons. One, it's another great character-focused episode, showing Rainbow not only as the confident character with the great ability to fly that we all know and love to whatever degree we happen to love her, but it also shows her vulnerable side, that she can get nervous and intimidated and be made to seem non-confident. That while her confidence isn't false, it does hide a sense of insecurity that she would rather not admit to. And that's okay. It shows that she's a well-rounded character, and it shows that she's got a lot going for her. The fact that it's one of the few episodes that focuses on dear old Rainbow and Rarity, which of course was lampshaded fairly recently in season 8.
There was that time during the Cloudsdale Best Young Flyer competition when I totally saved Rarity's life. Yes, and I once proved Rainbow Dash's innocence to her beloved Wonderbolts when she was being framed for a mysterious incident.
But the fact of the matter is, it shows a great bit of the fact that Rarity, while not necessarily intentionally insensitive, can be a bit of an attention hog. Almost, and it's probably the one real thing that her and Rainbow have in common. They do appreciate attention for what they see that they're good at or what they have in particular. In Rainbow's case, it's her skill as a flyer and as the fastest pony in Equestria, whereas dear old Rarity appreciates her beauty being viewed and her ability to accentuate things like her clothes and her makeup or whatever. I don't know. You get my point. Rarity appreciates when people appreciate her beauty. I mean, if she knew we existed, she'd probably be very flattered and in some cases very freaked out by the amount of attention we give her. Just saying. So overall, that makes this episode pretty darn good. I'd say great even. But another thing that the episode does really well is it introduces us to the sonic Rainboom, and it introduces us to us pretty well. It establishes that Rainbow has done it once before, and it establishes that she's the only pony in a very long time, if at all, to have been able to do it. It's not an easy thing to do, but she manages to just barely pull it off to save her friend and the Wonderbolts, who happen to be her idols. She also wins the Young Flyers competition because of it, and that's pretty great. Overall, I'd say this is a pretty great episode. It's pretty entertaining. It's good for the characters, and especially good for Rainbow. So, good job. Okay, so here we have the pilot, the two-parter that started it all. What can I say about it? Well, I think that these two episodes work together as one great story. I think it works well, especially considering that it has to introduce the 6 main characters, and Spike, even if he's not given all that much focus, outside of being Twilight's assistant. But the fact is that we're introduced to the 6 main characters, or the main 6 as we've all come to know them, and they do this pretty well, all things considered, in a not too contrived way. It's entertaining. We get a lot of interesting bits, and while some parts aren't as great as others, yeah, I've never been a big fan of that first song. The fact is that the overall quality of this two-parter stands up today, and I think it was a pretty good way for the series to start overall. I'm happy this is how we got here, and I'm happy that the fandom sparked from such a great beginning. This episode is one of the few in the season focusing on Pinkie as an individual character, and it's probably the one that does her the most credit. It showcases her personality well, it showcases what she's like when no pony else is around, both in and out of her better state of mind, and it shows that the main 6 are pretty good characters, even though no pony among them can lie well. Because, yeah, they weren't trying to hurt Pinkie's feelings. They were trying to set up for her own birthday party, which she apparently forgot about her own birthday, probably from having to store everybody else's birthday in mind. And frankly, she forgot, and therefore it turned into this.
I you, Madame LaFlower.
I'm just glad none of them ponies showed up, a bunch of losers.
Oh, come on now. Losers might be a little strong, don't you think?
Yeah, Megan McCarthy, you scare me. You scare me a lot. Regardless, though, this episode is entertaining because it shows that Pinkie depends on the company of others, that she is the kind of person who deals well when she has others around who can both entertain her and she can entertain. Her whole purpose is to bring joy to others, and if she feels she's failing on doing that, and worse, that her friends are abandoning her despite everything, then yeah, no wonder she slips into this state of mind. And I gotta be honest, while maybe not quite to the same extreme, I relate to this. I relate to this a lot. Almost as much, if not more, than when Applejack went kind of crazy with her whole, stubborn refusal of help in Applebuck season. But this I do relate to, and I genuinely like it. It's a misunderstanding, but it's a misunderstanding formed from good intentions. And you know what they say about good intentions? Well, they lead to a certain place that is a lot more chilly than most people would consider. Regardless, I will say that I happen to like this episode quite a bit. I like it as a focus on Pinkie. I like it as a focus showing how much the other members of the main six care about her as a friend. And I like it as an episode that shows that Megan McCarthy's writing is kind of crazy because sometimes, and, well, we wouldn't have breakdowns from the main characters otherwise, and this is a pretty good start to that. Bridal Gossip. Now, one particularly vocal and fairly well-known member of the fandom has called this one of the worst episodes the series has ever done. I have to disagree. I honestly very much enjoy this episode. Not only for introducing a fairly interesting new character, and while it is a pretty, lackluster message being something that everybody has apparently tried to teach the young and the old alike for a long time now, don't judge a book by its cover. They do this both literally and figuratively, but I can't tell if that's more subtle or less subtle. I feel like I should say less subtle automatically, but at the same time it's like, I mean, if we all didn't know this message already, would we really get it? I don't know. Regardless, it's entertaining for one thing and one thing alone. Outside of Zecora herself and getting introduced to this very mysterious character that we really don't get enough of in later seasons, we get the hilariousness of the main six being gagged by Poison Joke. Everything included, as pointed out here by dear old Spike.
This is hilarious! Look at all of you! We got Harity, Rainbow Crush, Spitty Pie, Apple Teeny, Flutter Guy, and... I got nothing. Twilight Sparkle. I mean, seriously, I can't even work with that.
Not only that, but Spike in and of himself is pretty great in this one scene. Yes, he's underutilized for the rest of the episode and the rest of the season, but the fact of the matter is that this sarcastic bit where he name calls the entire main six, maybe just a little bit meanly, but definitely in character because of his immaturity and his sarcastic sense of humor. We get the sense of what he's like and how he'll slowly become the wisecracking dragon that I absolutely love later on. A minor note, but definitely something worth noting of. Outside of that, the rest of the episode is great, and we get introduced to Apple Bloom, and frankly, being introduced to one of, if not all three of the Cutie Mark Crusaders early on definitely helps later down the line when we do get that episode. Again, a minor note, but that really is what works about this episode. The lesson isn't the best, even the execution isn't the best, but the fact of the matter is, I think the thing that works about this episode is all the little details. Everything from Spike's minor gag here and calling the main six their little names, to introducing Apple Bloom, to getting Zecora for the first time as well. Not to mention all of the gags themselves when it comes to the main six, being pretty funny, to varying degrees, of course, but still fairly funny. So overall, I'd say this episode, while not great, is pretty good and pretty entertaining. It's got nothing that really makes it stand out overall, but it does have a bunch of little things that I happen to enjoy quite a bit, including this.
Here we go. She's an evil enchantress. She does evil dances. And if you look deep in
Rarity.
I like the other version of the song too. I think this version just doesn't get enough love. This episode is probably the best one focused on Rarity throughout Season 1, at least with her as the primary focus. I can see why it's the episode so many will go to point out why she's their favorite character and why she became their favorite character. Now, I personally didn't like Rarity that much, for obvious reasons. Granted, I didn't dislike her, I just I wasn't super attached to her. But now she's like my third favorite pony out of the lot, after, of course, Pinky and just Twilight, respectively. But the fact of the matter is that this episode didn't really get me into her. Probably because when I first got into the series, I kind of rushed through the first few seasons to catch up, and didn't really focus on what was happening in the episodes until later down the line. But nowadays, as a fellow artist and a fan of Rarity overall, I can say that this episode definitely exemplifies the work an artist will go through to get something perfect, and the effect, the influence of the person you're making the art for can have on you, especially if they insist on their own views when you're making it. It showcases why an artist needs to be trusted in their work, but also why not speaking up about something like this can lead to embarrassment for every pony involved. Everybody from Rarity herself to the main six wearing the rather garish versions of their gala outfits, which, yeah.
Breathtaking designs of Ponyville's own Rarity!
Why's every pony looking at us like that?
I mean, wow. Overall, this is just a really good Rarity episode. It shows why she's such a good character in the overall, why she's a great artist, and how you can make the design of clothing look interesting. Seriously, I never thought that was really something that could be done. And considering I have an actual clothing designer as a cousin, I'm sorry, Alex. I underestimated what you do, and I apologize. It's clearly a lot more interesting than I ever gave it credit for, and you're an artist in your own right. But enough of the personal stuff. I like this episode. I like it quite a bit more than I would honestly say, especially since Fluttershy, more often than not, is one of my, and I hate to say this, least favorite main six characters. Don't get me wrong, I love Fluttershy. She's adorable. But honestly, being adorable is not going to get you praise from me all that often. I'll squee, but that's about it. With Fluttershy, her biggest flaw is that she, well, is shy. And that's from a personal standpoint, not from a character standpoint. Being shy is actually a pretty good character point, though it does get overused quite a bit in mainstream media. But this episode gets us a little bit more of Fluttershy, and honestly, it's probably her most entertaining episode that we've gotten, at least from Season 1's point of view. Here we get to see her show her quirks when it comes to being afraid, but it also shows that she can be brave under the right circumstances, something we really hadn't seen. Yeah, it seemed brave when she helped the Manticore in the first episode, but the fact of the matter is that that wasn't really her bravery. That was the fact that she's just not being afraid. Bravery is not the absence of fear, it's the fear being there and you having to deal with it, you having to face it. But there, she was completely unafraid, because in the end, she's not afraid of animals or beasts. And with the big exception being in this episode, she is afraid of dragons. And that's amazing, because not only is it a reasonable fear compared to a lot of the other things she's afraid of, but frankly, it makes a lot of sense, especially with the way she explains it here.
I'm scared of... What's that, Sugar Cube? I'm scared of dragons. What? I'm scared of dragons.
You have a wonderful talent dealing with all kinds of animals.
Yes, because they're not dragons.
Oh, come on! We've seen you walk right up to a horrible manticore like it was nothing.
Smoke snoring could eat a pony in one bite. Totally all grown up dragon.
Not only that, but the episode has the main six going on a quest again, going on an adventure, something that unfortunately wasn't seen as much early on in the series. And so seeing them do something like climb a mountain to try and confront a dragon is kind of epic. That and Twilight's ability to designate roles shows her leadership ability early on, and it shows that she knows her friends pretty well by this point. Very Tolkien-esque, it's very entertaining, and I am a huge fan of dragons. Like, I cannot emphasize that enough. It's part of the reason why Spike is my favorite character, even though I will say Season 1 probably has nothing to do with why that's the case, outside of him being a dragon. But the way they treat dragons in this series is pretty cool, outside of some of the personalities they gave them later on. But outside of that, I like this episode because we get a little bit more of the main six working together to save the day in a capacity on a little adventure. And beyond that, we get a good side of Fluttershy and what her character is really like. And it shows that she's more than just a meek, adorable individual who doesn't want to leave her home and is basically agoraphobic. In reality, she's more than that. She will stand up to bullies, as she calls the very large, very dangerous dragon. It's amazing, it's great, I'm happy that she was able to stand up to this dragon. I was happy that she was able to save her friends, and that she was responsible for it. It was a good Fluttershy episode, a good episode overall. I love dragons. Moving on. Here we have it, folks. This is the episode. This, in my opinion, is the best episode of My Little Pony Friendship is Magic Season 1. This is the Cutie Mark Chronicles. Now, why is this the best episode as far as I'm concerned? Well, one, I think that it's overall good for characterization. Two, it's not mainly focused on the main six, even though they are in the episode overall. It's mainly focused on the CMC. It's an episode that manages to give a good amount of focus to the CMC while also having the main six in at the same time. And we get an interesting number of stories concerning their history. As I said when it came to the episode Sonic Rainboom, we got introduced to the concept of the Sonic Rainboom early, and we heard that old Rainbow had done it once before. Here, we get the story of the Sonic Rainboom without initially being told that's what this is. We also get a focus on each of the main six as children, not only looking adorable, mind you, but also giving us a grasp of what their personalities would be like in the future without fully showing that that's what they are as children as well. And frankly, that's amazing. And like I said, since the focus is also primarily on the Cutie Mark Crusaders trying to get their cutie marks, it adds an interesting interval is that they still aren't quite understanding what getting the cutie marks is all about, even though they're being told very clearly that that's exactly how to get their cutie mark, or at least the important part of learning about getting their cutie mark. That focusing so much on it is probably what's keeping them from getting that. Overall, this episode is just entertaining, and I love the individual stories about the main six figuring out their talents. How Rarities, while being fashion-related, also has more to do with gems like her cutie mark actually is. And the fact that her early fashion sense, while not awesome, does display the level of skill she would show in the future, while also being mainly focused on just making everything prettier by putting gemstones on it. Something she hasn't totally lost a focus on. Plus, and I can't help but bring this up, Pinky's story is great for me. One, because Pinky is my waifu, but also because we get the beginning of her backstory with her strange family that grew up on a rock farm, which we still don't really understand. What does a rock farm actually do? I mean, maybe they sell rocks, but if that's the case, how does it work exactly? Hey, someone, please, make a video about this. I might make a video about this. But my point is, I like it, and I like seeing that Pinky wasn't always so cheerful and focused on bringing joy and happiness to others. This is how she got it. And of course, there's something like Twilight with her not realizing her talent for magic until accidentally having it triggered and therefore causing her cutie mark to appear. Not to mention, if it wasn't for the Sonic Rainboom, the original Sonic Rainboom, then Spike would never have been born. This is a really good episode. It's a great character-focused episode, which again seems to be what this season has managed to have its greatest successes in. It's entertaining, it's interesting, we get a little bit of each of the characters from the main 6 and the CMC. Sadly, we only get Spike's birth, but that's enough for me under these circumstances. And frankly, it's overall entertaining. And the fact that it was the first episode in a long string of episodes written by M.A. Larson? Interesting. So, that was my ranking of the episodes of MLP in Season 1. I hope you all enjoyed that. This is Mike, Ringmaster of the Imagination Circus, and I will be doing this for the other seasons coming up in the future. I hope that this was to your liking, and please come back for more. Thank you.